You know that feeling when you realize you've made a terrible mistake and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it? That weight in your chest. That cold moment of clarity when the world suddenly feels smaller and darker than it did 5 seconds ago. Now imagine that feeling lasting 30 years. But before we get into the kind of story that sits with you long after the credits roll, let me ask you something. Where are you right now? Are you comfortable? Is your phone on silent, or are you one of those people who likes to live dangerously and keep notifications on? Here's a thought: dim the lights if you haven't already. Open a window. Maybe turn on a fan. Something about crime stories and white noise just hits different at night. And while you're settling in, here's a question that's been bothering me. What exactly is the right amount of suspicion? If your neighbor's car has been in the shop for 2 weeks and suddenly it's gone, is that normal? What if it happens 3 times in a month? At what point does routine become ritual, become something darker? Nobody knows. That's the problem. Oh, and one more thing before we dive in. Like, subscribe, comment, but only if you actually want to. No judgment either way. Just, if you do stick around, tell us where you're watching from. We genuinely want to know if you're in bed, at your kitchen table, or doing something weird like watching this in a parking lot. We won't judge. Now, let's talk about Marcus Webb. Not because his story is unique. Because it absolutely isn't. But because it's the kind of story that reveals something uncomfortable about how the system works when nobody's paying attention. Marcus Webb woke up like he did every morning for 3 decades, behind bars, in a cell that had become more familiar than any home he'd ever known. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual tune, casting that particular shade of institutional white across cinder block walls. The kind of white that has no warmth in it. The kind of white that exists only in places that want to remove all sense of time, comfort, or hope. But this morning was different. A lawyer he'd never met was standing outside his cell holding a folder. Her name was Rebecca, and she had been a law student when Marcus went to prison. She had been 8 years old when his trial ended. She had spent the last 2 years reading through his case file, 1 page at a time, looking for the thread that might unravel everything. The folder she held contained something the original investigation in 1994 never had: the truth. Well, more specifically, it contained a DNA report. Biological evidence from the crime scene. Results that came back in 48 hours with technology that didn't exist when Marcus was convicted. Results that said, very clearly and in no uncertain terms, that Marcus Webb was not the man who attacked Patricia Holloway. He had spent 30 years in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. There's a particular kind of silence that follows that kind of news. Not the silence of relief. Not the silence of joy. It's the silence of someone trying to process the fact that 30 years of their life, your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, have been erased by a mistake. A mistake that started with assumptions and ended with handcuffs. Marcus walked out of the prison on a Tuesday morning in 2024. The sun looked different than he remembered. The world had changed. He had not. The question that nobody wants to answer is simple. What do you do with someone after you've stolen 30 years of their life? Let's go back now. Let's travel back to 1994, a year when people still rented movies instead of streaming them, when cell phones existed but nobody carried them in their pocket, when the internet was something you dialed into with a sound like a robot dying. It was a Tuesday night. October 18, 1994. A working-class neighborhood in a Midwestern city. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant that nobody actually knew anything at all. Gossip and assumption are two different things, even if they dress the same. Patricia Holloway lived in a first-floor apartment on Maple Street. 32 years old. She worked at a bank. She had a routine: up at 6:15 a.m., coffee black, no sugar, train to work, home by 5:45 p.m. on most days. On this particular Tuesday, she came home at her usual time. She made dinner. She watched television. At approximately 11:30 p.m., someone entered her apartment. What happened next would be the basis for a trial, a conviction, and 30 years of someone else's life spent in a cage. The details, though, were slippery from the start. One neighbor said they heard screaming. Another said they heard music and assumed nothing was wrong. A third neighbor said they heard what might have been arguing, but television sets were loud in those days, and nobody wanted to get involved. Patricia was badly injured, and the police arrived at 12:15 a.m. in response to a call from the apartment complex manager. The investigation that followed was thorough in the way that investigations conducted under pressure and without proper procedure can be thorough. They moved fast, they moved with certainty, and they moved in one direction only. Within 72 hours, they had a suspect. Within 3 weeks, they had an arrest. Within 6 months, they had a trial. Within 6 months and 2 weeks, they had a conviction. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours to agree that they were absolutely certain that the man they were looking at, Marcus Webb, age 23, no prior felonies, no history of violence, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. 3 hours. For 30 years. Here's what we know about eyewitness identification: it's the least reliable form of evidence that courts still treat as if it's basically gospel. The human brain, that magnificent meat computer in your skull, is spectacularly bad at remembering faces, especially under stress. Especially when someone is telling you that the person you're looking at might have done something terrible. The brain becomes a suggestion-taking machine. It fills in gaps. It assumes. It confirms what it's being told to confirm. In Marcus Webb's case, 5 separate people identified him in a lineup. Person 1 saw him clearly. They were certain. Well, pretty certain. Actually, they were fairly sure, but by the time they were testifying in court 3 months later, the certainty had calcified into absolute fact. Person 2 was pretty sure it was him. When asked how certain on a scale of 1 to 10, they said 7. When the prosecutor asked them again with slightly different phrasing, they said 9. Person 3 wasn't sure at all. When interviewed initially, they said the person they saw was maybe his height, maybe his build, but they couldn't really see the face clearly. By the time they took the stand, they said they were sure. Not entirely sure, but sure enough. Person 4 had seen someone running from the apartment complex that night. A man of average height, average build, wearing dark clothes. This description fit approximately 40% of the men in the city. It certainly fit Marcus Webb. It also fit approximately 8 million other people. Person 5 changed their story 3 times before settling on identification. Nobody bothered to ask why. The lineup itself was a masterclass in leading the witness. Marcus was wearing a specific style of jacket that the other people in the lineup were not wearing. He was the only one who fit the description the witness had vaguely given weeks earlier. He was essentially a target with a spotlight on him. And yet, those 5 identifications became the foundation of the case. Not because they were strong, but because they were all the prosecutors had that felt concrete. Here's the thing about eyewitness identification that should keep you up at night: it's the leading cause of wrongful convictions in the United States. More than DNA evidence later exonerated. More than false confessions. More than anything else. The human brain, trying its best, getting it completely wrong, with absolute confidence. By the time Marcus was convicted, those 5 identifications had been repeated so many times in the investigation, in the papers, in the courthouse, that they felt like established fact rather than what they actually were: 5 people's imperfect memories in a situation they hadn't expected. And that was the entire case against him. This is where things get darker. Not because they involve violence, but because they involve something worse: institutional coercion so normalized that nobody even recognized it as coercion. Marcus Webb was brought in for questioning on October 20, 1994. 2 days after the attack. He was 23 years old. He had never been arrested before. He had no lawyer present during the initial interrogation, which lasted 14 hours. 14 hours. Think about that. 14 hours in a room with 2 detectives who are telling you that 5 people have identified you. 14 hours of being told that your denials don't make sense. 14 hours of suggestion and repetition and the slow erosion of your own certainty about where you were and what you did. By hour 12, Marcus was tired. By hour 13, he was confused. By hour 14, he was saying what they wanted him to say. The confession that came out of that interrogation room was remarkable, in retrospect, for how perfectly it matched the prosecution's theory. It was like Marcus had been reading from a script written specifically to fit their narrative. Except he had never been to Patricia Holloway's apartment before. He didn't know the layout. When asked to describe which room the attack happened in, he got it wrong. When asked about specific details, he got confused. He described going in through a front door, when the door was actually on the side. He described a window that didn't exist. An innocent person being interrogated for 14 hours will often say whatever they think will make the interrogation stop. They will confess to things they didn't do. They will agree with details that don't match their memory. They will do whatever it takes to escape the situation. A guilty person, having actually committed the crime, would know these details. They would remember the layout. They would know which door they used. They would know what room they were in. Marcus got the details wrong because he wasn't there. But nobody listened to the tape with fresh ears until decades later. By then, the confession had done its job. It had been performed in court. It had been repeated in the papers. It had become part of the official story. The official story that would keep a man in prison for 30 years. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours to change a life forever. Marcus Webb was convicted on November 14, 1994. 19 days after Patricia Holloway was attacked. The judge sentenced him to 55 years in prison, which meant that if he lived long enough, he might be released around age 80. If the system was generous. If he was lucky. He was neither. He became inmate 447B. He was assigned a cell. He was given a number. His name became less important than the number on his uniform. He attended programs because programs were mandatory. He read books because books were the only way to travel without leaving. He wrote letters to lawyers who didn't respond. He learned to speak quietly, to move carefully, to take up as little space as possible. He became exactly what the system expected, invisible. The years accumulated the way years do when you're not paying attention because you have no choice but to not pay attention. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. The world outside changed in ways Marcus couldn't quite comprehend. Technology evolved. Social media became a thing. Smartphones became ubiquitous. The internet became something you carried in your pocket rather than something you sat down at a desk to access. Marcus saw these changes on television in the common room, filtered through news broadcasts and prison-approved programming. He was 30 in the year 2001. He was 40 in 2011. He was 50 in 2021. 50 years old and still in a cell, still a number, still a man who had committed a crime he didn't commit. Other inmates came and went. Some were released. Some died. Some were transferred. The prison population around him was a constantly shifting ecosystem of people serving their time, paying their debt to society for things they had done and, in some cases, things they had not. Marcus had a job in the prison library. He organized books. He helped other inmates find reading material. He became a resource, which meant he had value, which meant life was slightly more bearable than it might have been otherwise. But bearable is not the same as livable. And 30 years is a long time to be barely living. In 2018, a graduate student named Rachel Chen was doing research on wrongful convictions for her dissertation. She was interested in cases from the 1990s where DNA evidence might have been collected but never tested. The technology existed now, but it didn't exist then. That meant there were potentially thousands of cases where biological evidence sat in evidence lockers, waiting. Rachel was working through a database of convicted inmates when she came across Marcus Webb's case file. She read the trial transcript. She listened to the recorded interrogation. She reviewed the original crime scene photographs. And she noticed something that nobody in 1994 had thought to check, or maybe had thought to check and decided wasn't worth pursuing. There was biological evidence from the crime scene. Not enough to definitively prove anything with 1990s technology, but enough to preserve for later testing. Blood that didn't belong to Patricia Holloway. Skin cells under her fingernails. Bodily fluids. All of it had been collected. All of it had been sitting in an evidence locker for 24 years. Rachel filed a motion to have the evidence tested using modern DNA analysis. The motion was granted, mostly because there was no good reason to deny it. What could testing possibly hurt? If Marcus was guilty, the test would confirm it. If he was innocent, well, that would be something else entirely. The test took 48 hours to process. The results came back on a Tuesday afternoon in 2019. They did not match Marcus Webb's DNA. They matched someone else entirely. A man named Derek Hansen, who had died in prison in 2003 on an unrelated murder conviction. Derek Hansen, who had been serving time in the same prison system as Marcus Webb, in different facilities, for a different crime, unaware that he was also responsible for the crime that Marcus Webb was serving time for. Derek Hansen had never been suspected in Patricia Holloway's case. He had never been questioned. He had never been on the radar. But his DNA was under her fingernails. His DNA was in her blood. His DNA was everywhere Marcus Webb was not. When Rebecca, the lawyer we met at the beginning, walked up to Marcus Webb's cell on that Tuesday morning in 2024, she was carrying the news that would undo 30 years. 30 years of sleep on a thin mattress. 30 years of fluorescent lights. 30 years of processed food. 30 years of missing his family. His mother had died in 2009. His father in 2015. His sister was still alive, but they had grown apart in the way families do when there's too much time and too much pain between them. The exoneration itself was almost anticlimactic. The DNA evidence was clear. The case against Marcus had been circumstantial at best and fraudulent at worst. A confession obtained after 14 hours of interrogation without proper legal representation. Eyewitness identifications that wouldn't hold up under modern scrutiny. No physical evidence connecting him to the crime. No motive. No history of violence. He had been convicted on the weight of 5 imperfect memories and 1 coerced confession. The legal machinery that had destroyed Marcus Webb's life began moving in reverse. Slowly. Grinding against itself. Decades overdue. He was released on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. He walked out of the prison at 7:15 a.m. The sun was bright. The world was loud. The world was fast. Everyone was looking at their phones, which didn't exist when he went to prison. He had been 30 when he entered the system. He was 53 when he left. The question wasn't whether he was innocent. The DNA had answered that, conclusively and permanently. The question was what you do with someone after you've stolen 30 years of their life and finally, reluctantly, admitted you were wrong. The state offered him money. $130,000. Roughly $4,000 per year of wrongful incarceration. That came out to about $11 a day for every day of his life that had been taken from him. Marcus took the money, because what choice did he have? He needed to start somewhere, and anywhere is somewhere. He got an apartment. A small place. He learned how to use the internet. He learned about smartphones. He learned that the world had moved on without him, which everyone already knew, but there's a difference between knowing it intellectually and experiencing it. And he waited for Derek Hansen's family to file a civil suit, because they wanted accountability too. Because Derek Hansen's crime had resulted in Marcus Webb's wrongful conviction, and nobody had been held accountable for the sloppy investigation that had let a guilty man walk free while an innocent man stayed locked away. The case revealed something uncomfortable about the system: it doesn't actually care about truth. It cares about closure. It cares about conviction rates. It cares about moving cases through the system and declaring them solved. Patricia Holloway's actual attacker went free for decades because nobody bothered to do the DNA test. Marcus Webb remained in prison because 5 people's imperfect memories and 1 coerced confession were enough to convince 12 people of his guilt. The system worked exactly as designed. And that's the part that should keep you up at night. Not that mistakes happen. Mistakes are inevitable. But that the mistakes are baked into the process. That the system is built in a way that prioritizes speed over accuracy, closure over truth, confidence over doubt. Marcus Webb walked free in 2024, 30 years too late, because one graduate student named Rachel Chin decided to look at a cold case that nobody else was willing to examine. One person. One decision. One moment of curiosity. That was all that stood between innocence and 30 years in a cell. That's where we leave Marcus Webb's story, for now. A man who lost 30 years and survived it. A system that failed him systematically. A question that nobody wants to answer: how many other Marcus Webbs are still in cells right now, waiting for someone to finally look at their case? Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. Are you in bed? At your kitchen table? Somewhere unexpected? And if you stuck with us this long, hit that subscribe button. Tell a friend about the channel. Leave a comment if this story messed with your head the way it's messing with ours. Stay safe out there. The world is stranger than we want to admit, and the system is slower to correct its mistakes than it should be. We'll see you next time. It's late. You're still here. You've spent the last 15 minutes inside a story that reveals something uncomfortable about the world you live in, and now you're sitting with that weight. Marcus Webb's story isn't unique. That's the part that should actually terrify you. There are others. There are people right now, as you're reading this, sitting in cells for crimes they didn't commit. People whose eyewitness identifications were uncertain. People whose confessions were coerced. People who are waiting for someone like Rachel Chen to decide their case is worth examining. The system doesn't do that automatically. The system moves forward, not backward. It protects itself. It prioritizes closure over truth. And the people who pay for that are the ones without resources, without lawyers, without the luck of being noticed by a graduate student working on a dissertation. But here's what we can actually take from this: 30 years is a long time. It's long enough that most people would have given up. Marcus didn't. The system destroyed him, and he survived it. That kind of resilience is real. That kind of survival is something that matters. We live in a world now where DNA testing is routine. Where records are digitized. Where cases can be reopened. Where a single person with curiosity can actually change someone's life. That's not nothing. That's an evolution. It's slow, and it's imperfect, but it's happening. Take that with you when you leave here. When you turn off this video and close your eyes, remember that somewhere, someone is fighting for their innocence. And somewhere else, someone is finally listening. Sleep well tonight knowing that the safety you take for granted, the freedom to walk outside without fear of wrongful conviction, is something worth protecting. Not just for yourself, but for the people who weren't so lucky. We'll be here next time. Same late hour. Same stories. Same questions nobody wants to answer. Until then, stay curious. Stay skeptical. Stay human.